Bible Answers with Dr. Al Garza.
All right, welcome back to Bible Answers Unfiltered. I am your host, Dr. Al Garza. Today's PowerPoint presentation will be on searching for the New Testament in Hebrew. Was Hebrew a dead language in the first century? We're going to be going through the body of evidence that shows that Hebrew was a dominant language in the first century with Aramaic and Greek. We're also going to take a look at why Aramaic replaced Hebrew, and of course, the idea of a Greek New Testament only premise. When did that start, and what were some of the reasons behind it? And what is today's evidence of academia that points to a possible Hebrew New Testament within the Gospels or even some of Paul's writings? So let's take a look at this first part. This probably will be part one of many. But let's take a look at some of the evidence of the beginnings of where all this began. All right, let's take a look at some of the evidence. Scholars of the New Testament believe that only two languages, Aramaic and Greek, were spoken in Israel. According to this view, Hebrew was a dead or exclusively religious language restricted to educated religious teachers. This was the consensus. Now, where did this come from exactly? Well, the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church 1958 edition, it's basically the first edition, states the following in the section of Hebrew, that Hebrew, it ceased to be a spoken language about the 4th century BC. So this was the consensus of the scholarship, that Hebrew was a dead language and that it ceased to be spoken about the 4th century BC. So the scholarly discussion has been dominated by the hypothesis that Jesus spoke Aramaic most of the time. This hypothesis was established in the 19th century, but very few scholars today know how it came into existence and on what basis it was founded. Perhaps Jesus spoke and taught in Hebrew rather than Aramaic or Greek based on the evidence. So as we can see, within the 19th century, this pretty much was the dominant consensus within academia regarding Aramaic and the language of Yeshua Jesus. Now, reformers like John Calvin maintained that the Chaldaic language replaced Hebrew after the exile, adding that when the evangelist used the word Hebrew, he is referring to the Chaldean or Syriac language. As a result of studies conducted at the end of the 18th century, a common understanding developed that Chaldaic or Syro-Chaldaic was the language of Jesus. And this language was shaped by prominent scholars such as Abraham Geiger and Gustav Dahlmann in the 19th century. Now, in the past century, there has been a dramatic change in this situation. Hebrew and Aramaic literature's landscape changed dramatically during the Second Temple period since the discoveries in Cairo, Geniza. This was followed by discovering the Dead Sea Scrolls, Bar Kokhba letter, and other Judean desert documents. This forced the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church to change their position in their 1997 third edition, page 742. Quote, Hebrew continued to be used as a spoken and written language after the classical period and is found in the text from Qumran and in the Mishnah. It survived as a written language to the present day. That's interesting to note, the change from the first edition to the third edition. Now, over the past century, archaeological evidence has challenged the assumption of a Greek-only New Testament and changed our understanding of Judea's linguistic environment. As seen from the inscription of literary evidence, this is much like what can be found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Qumran library contains 700 non-biblical manuscripts, 120 written in Aramaic, 28 in Greek, and 550 in Hebrew. So we see that the dominant language written in non-biblical manuscripts was mainly in Hebrew. The New Testament is set in a predominantly Semitic region in the 1st century CE. It is set in the 1st century CE Jewish world, and Hebrew and Aramaic were the languages spoken by most Jews at that time. Jesus and his disciples were Jewish and would have spoken Hebrew as their primary language. So according to the textual evidence retrieved from Qumran's caves, a trilingual landscape was present: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. All of the documents that have been attributed to the Qumran community were written in Hebrew, especially those documents that were central to communal, theological, and eschatological thought. It is important to note that the Jewish inhabitants of Israel at the time of Jesus knew Aramaic and used it in their correspondence with the ordinary non-Jewish inhabitants of that land. However, Hebrew was their mother tongue. Hebrew was a dominant language spoken in enlightened circles such as Jesus' disciples. We must remember that in the Greek New Testament, we see many Hebrew words that have been transliterated into Greek, like Sabbath, Satan, and Amen. At the time of Jesus, Hebrew was unquestionably the primary written language in Israel across all Jewish denominations and all forms of literature. There are few Aramaic documents from this period, but they pale compared to the great body of Hebrew literature. As a result, it is not out of the question that Jesus spoke in Hebrew and that his biography was written in Hebrew based on all the evidence. All right, let's take a look at the conclusion and some key takeaways. Number one, the Oxford Dictionary changed their position that Hebrew was a dead language during the first century based on the evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, this is important because their first edition printed that the Hebrew was a dead language during the time of Jesus and had to reprint in their third edition that it was then a spoken and written language during that time. Now, this hasn't changed in most academia circles because in most academia circles, it's still believed that Jesus spoke Aramaic, which replaced Hebrew, and that Greek was the dominant language of the New Testament. Number two, scholars continued and still continue to this day to teach outdated ideas of Hebrew being replaced by Aramaic and that Greek was the language or the primary language of the New Testament despite the discoveries from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, we saw from the Dead Sea Scrolls that the primary written and spoken language was Hebrew, very few Greek manuscripts, and then some Aramaic, but predominantly Hebrew was discovered and found. And these were all non-biblical texts. Third, the Dead Sea Scrolls show that Hebrew was the dominant written and spoken language during the time of Jesus and his disciples. We also know that parables were only spoken to disciples, from rabbis to the disciples, only in Hebrew. We don't have any in Aramaic or in Greek. It seems that this was the language that was taught, spoken and taught between rabbis and their disciples. And we know that Jesus was a rabbi and his mother tongue would have been Hebrew, speaking and teaching in Hebrew during the first century. So we need to kind of bring the current evidence into academia to show that Hebrew was not replaced by Aramaic, it was not a dead language, and Greek was not the primary language of the New Testament, but is a translation of what the language of Yeshua, Jesus, and the disciples would have spoke, predominantly Hebrew with Aramaic.
Bible Answers with Dr. Al Garza.